So labor trafficking is defined by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which was again reauthorized several times since then as we've learned more about what labor trafficking looks like. But it is defined as the recruitment or harboring and or transportation, provision and or obtaining of a person through the means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So all of these processes don't have to be present all at once, but there has to be a process. So someone is recruiting a person through means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of forced labor. Someone is transporting through means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of forced labor or debt bondage. There's somebody else who's receiving, who's harboring, who's transporting. So one of those processes has to be present. And we also have to prove an element of force, fraud, or coercion, that a person was forced, tricked, or coerced into forced labor, indentured servitude, debt bondage, or a form of slavery. What do we mean by forced fraud or coercion? So force is what you would typically think of. It's going to be that power and dominance used to force a person into a situation. So kidnapping, physical and sexual violence, drugging, isolation, use of fear, use of weapons to force a person into a forced labor situation. Fraud is that element of trickery. So for high risk populations, particularly, especially when in situations where we see domestic victims of labor trafficking, they tend to be highly vulnerable populations, extremely impoverished, homeless populations, providing for basic needs for those individuals without explaining their true intention, turning that around and then using that as a way to exploit that victim. False promises of money, of wealth, of goods and services, rewards. And then also this bait and switch tactic or misrepresentation of work. So you're a doctor in your country, you're going to come to the United States and be a doctor in the United States. But then when they get here and they go through the visa process and they go through the travel, they find out that they're actually working a different job. They're getting paid little to nothing at all. The working conditions are different than what they were told and so forth. So we see that level of trickery there. And then there's also elements of coercion, which is psychological, verbal violence, threats, blackmailing, and the use of debt bondage. And oftentimes threats are threats against the safety of the victim or the victim's family. And we'll talk more about debt bondage. A couple of quick distinctions that we want to make sure that we make that are really important when we're talking about trafficking, but also about labor trafficking specifically. But there is a difference between human smuggling and human trafficking. And we like to make this distinction because oftentimes people, the word trafficking can be misleading because it implies travel, when actually travel does not have to be present for human trafficking to be prevalent. So in a smuggling case, that is different. In human smuggling, transportation is most of the time the only element that's in place. It's not a crime against a person, but it's actually human smuggling is a crime against a country's sovereignty. It is the illegal crossing of a national border. For the person who is being smuggled, there is an element of consent. And that's not to say that they may not experience violence, they may not experience trauma, and that may not turn into an exploitative experience later. But in the beginning, there was an element of consent to an exchange of money to be transferred across a border. So there's an element of consent there. It often only involves transportation, and it ends usually with the arrival at the destination. However, human smuggling can be a gateway to human trafficking, especially if that smuggler is working in tandem with the trafficker, or if something happens in that the person being smuggled incurs debt along the way. It is a gateway. It is a risk and a vulnerability for experiencing human trafficking. But human trafficking in and of itself is a crime against the person. It involves forced labor, so types of labor trafficking, and also commercial sex acts, which would be considered sex trafficking. But in an instance of crossing borders if there is an element of travel, and a person's crossing a national border, that person can either enter the country legally or illegally. And oftentimes, people who are brought into the United States for forced labor are brought into the United States through legal channels. And traffickers are exploiting legal channels in order to exploit those individuals. there is no element of consent there. Even if in the beginning there were elements of fraud and the person believed they were coming for a different job or a different purpose, it turns into no consent, or when those elements of force, fraud, or coercion become prevalent. There's no freedom to leave, no freedom of movement, and that person is no longer consenting but is not able to leave the situation. Again, transportation is not required, but is oftentimes an element. And again, the connection between human smuggling and human trafficking is that sometimes individuals will incur debt along the way in a smuggling case, and smugglers can utilize that debt as a term of employment, and then in turn exploit a person for labor because of that. Another really important distinguishment that we like to make, and this is something that Dominique actually touched on as well, is the difficulty with essentially demonstrating that a labor trafficking situation is taking place, because there's a labor exploitation and there's labor trafficking. And the things that they both have in common are unfair wages or wages left unpaid, or substandard working and living conditions. And so those elements alone don't demonstrate labor trafficking. What they might demonstrate is labor exploitation. But what distinguishes labor trafficking from labor exploitation is the presence of force, fraud, or coercion. Someone is forcing, tricking, or coercing a person to work for unfair or no wages at all, and is forcing them to work in substandard working conditions or living conditions. And there's no element of movement or freedom to leave. So in a labor exploitation experience, they are experiencing those unjust situations, but they are free to leave and terminate their employment if they wish. In a labor trafficking situation, there's no freedom to do that, no freedom to leave the situation, and no freedom to terminate that employment without fear of retaliation. And there's the elements of force, fraud, or coercion that have to be proven to demonstrate that it's more than labor exploitation. So there are several definitions for what labor trafficking looks like. There are various ways in which a person could experience labor trafficking. The first of which is forced labor, which is that use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person to some form of work. That's kind of the basic definition of labor trafficking or forced labor. There's also child trafficking, which involves all forms of slavery or practices similar to slavery, including forced labor, but also sex trafficking and forms of sexual exploitation for children under the age of 18. But it should be noted that just because a person's under the age of 18, it doesn't. So in the federal definition for sex trafficking, if a child is exchanging sex for something of value, they're automatically a sex trafficking victim. We don't have to prove elements of force, fraud, or coercion. It's very cut and dry. In a child labor trafficking situation, we do still have to prove elements of force, fraud, or coercion because it could also be considered labor exploitation depending on their age. And also in certain industries such as agriculture work, children are able to, there are actual legal standards that allow children to work at younger ages than normal in agricultural settings. So it's not automatically child labor trafficking like it would be sex trafficking. And that's, again, one of those nuances that make labor trafficking a little bit more difficult for us to protect against. Other things that you might see in a labor trafficking situation is something called domestic servitude. And this tends to be different than working in an industry or being forced to work in a hotel or in a restaurant or things like that. Domestic servitude tends to be in a home, in a private residence, and serving a single person or a family. And it tends to be very isolating and very difficult to identify because that person is oftentimes forced to stay there, not allowed to leave. There may be language barriers, things like that, and they're generally unpaid or extremely underpaid, and also experience the whole gamut of different types of violence in that situation as well. And then lastly is debt bondage, also known as bonded labor or peonage. And this is when a trafficker will kind of fabricate debt for the victim and then use that as a term of employment. So for instance, if I'm recruiting someone in a different country and I say, you're a doctor and I want you to come be a doctor here in the United States, I'm going to do the legal channels to get you your visa. I'm going to pay for your visa. I'm going to pay for your travel. Someone will be there on the other end to meet you and transport you to your lodging. And all of those things will be paid for. And then once that person gets to the United States, they find out that they now owe that trafficker or that staffing agency or whatever that person was to them, the recruiter, all of the money that they spent to go through that hiring process. And then what they do is they oftentimes will impose interest in which that person is not able to pay off. So they incur this debt that they have to work to pay off with interest that they'll never be able to pay. And so they utilize that as a term of employment to force a person to work, and that's considered debt bondage. Labor trafficking can occur in any industry. It occurs in various industries. It can be anything. These are some of the industries that we have seen that are common in the United States and in which we see labor trafficking. But as you can see, labor trafficking can occur from a single labor trafficker. And we'll talk a little bit about a study that ASU did that kind of illustrates this a little bit more. But it can be an individual trafficker who's trafficking and forcing someone to panhandle or forcing someone to go door to door. We see children who often get forced into door-to-door sales or things like that. It could be for a company, for construction, for healthcare, assisted living facilities, in a restaurant. It can be an individual trafficker, or it can be a criminal organization of multiple traffickers who are recruiting, transporting, harboring, being the ones who are enforcing. It could be even more sophisticated. And also our research has started to also incorporate corporations and companies that are complicit in that labor trafficking experience as well. So it can be multiple different things, and it can occur in many venues. And there are some vulnerabilities that create an environment in which traffickers will exploit those vulnerabilities for forced labor. So especially with domestic victims, one of the things that we see is individuals who are experiencing poverty or who are experiencing homelessness. And in our research, and we'll talk a little bit about this as well, in homeless young adults, we see this is very prevalent. Because there's those basic needs that need to be met, which create that vulnerability for a person to come in and exploit those needs, provide for those needs, and then turn around and use that as a way to coerce them into forced labor. Then for foreign national victims, like seasonal workers who are here for certain seasons of the year, they're coming here for work, they're in unfamiliar territory, they may have a language barrier, they may not understand what their labor rights are or feel like they are protected by labor rights. They may be told that they may be given false information about their immigration status, and used threats about deportation or being reported to law enforcement or things like that. So they may be susceptible to ways in which traffickers can exploit them and force them into work. Other things that create a sense of instability and also those that need for basic needs is persons who are in a war-torn area experiencing economic instability, class systems, and so forth, that are displaced and in an unfamiliar setting, who do need to have their basic needs met and are unfamiliar with systems, their rights, and savvy traffickers are able to navigate that and utilize that. Lack of legal status, being undocumented or having your documentation taken from you creates that vulnerability. Language barriers. And then, of course, the International Labor Organization has put out some research that just, again, demonstrates that women and girls are disproportionately more at risk or likely to be in a trafficking situation, and children may represent as much as 1 in 4 victims of modern slavery. And another thing is not just the vulnerabilities of the individual that create the environment for traffickers to exploit. There's also some loopholes in some of the policies that are set forth to provide protections for trafficking victims. For instance, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the next presenters will talk to you all about these things as well, so I won't go too far into them, but the Fair Labor Standards Act, for instance, is put in place to provide provisions for minimum wage and overtime for workers, and also to set up standards for child labor. But up until 1966, agricultural workers in particular were not even included as a population that was protected under this act. And once they became included, they still were exempt from overtime protections. So agricultural workers are actually not protected for overtime. And there are some loopholes that farm employers or ag employers are able to kind of utilize in order to also supersede the minimum wage protections. For instance, if they work on a small farm that hires less than 7 ag workers in a quarter calendar of a year, if that person is paid on a piece rate basis, which means if they're paid per tomato or per apple, they are exempt from minimum wage protections. If they work mostly with livestock, if they worked less than 13 weeks the previous year, there are all these different kind of loopholes that would exempt them from being able to receive that federal minimum wage rate, which is $7.25. And also that child labor law, it actually provides provisions for children in agricultural work to work younger than what the national average is. The National Labor Relations Act is another act that seeks to kind of provide protections and provides the ability for people to organize and to bargain for collective rights. But agricultural workers are not included in that act. So they are not protected for organizing or bargaining for collective rights, while at the same time, agriculture employees are. And so they are organizing and lobbying to minimize some of the protections that are put in place, like for instance, the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Workers Protection Act, which is supposed to add some protections for agricultural workers, like higher standards of housing, higher standards of working conditions. But ag employers are lobbying against to kind of minimize and systematically cut those things down, while ag workers are not protected to organize or to bargain for their collective rights. So those things combined provide fewer protections against exploitation, particularly for agricultural workers. And traffickers are savvy and they know how to navigate those loopholes. Even in legal channels like our visa system, people are able to use certain seasonal visas that are legal channels to basically, some of those visas tie a person to that particular employer. So if that employer terminates that employment, their visa is void. And so some people will utilize that as a means to do whatever they want to do, and either pay unfair wages, but then utilize hold that over their head. If I terminate your employment, you are undocumented and I will report you to immigration and you'll be deported or you'll be sent to jail. And you don't have any rights. So you have to do what I say. And they use that as a term of employment. I'm going to briefly go over a study that we did, and this is actually old data now, but it is our data that is published in the Journal of Human Trafficking, a peer-reviewed journal. And what we did is we did an exploratory search. So researching this issue in the United States is incredibly difficult because a lot of cases go unreported. So although we know there are so many more cases of labor trafficking, they oftentimes go undocumented and unreported. And because of that, we are not able to find them if we're not working individually with every agency that serves labor trafficking victims. So as a very exploratory research on this issue, we wanted to take a look and see what the landscape of labor trafficking looks like in our country. So we did a media sweep of very specific arrests pertaining to labor trafficking. And we looked at it during a 4-year period from 2013 to 2016. And we wanted to see what labor trafficking looked like. How were labor traffickers recruiting victims? How were they controlling victims? Were there elements of travel that are important for us to know about? Are they individuals? Are they criminal organizations? So we wanted to kind of understand and explore the landscape of labor trafficking within the United States. And so these are the findings, brief findings from that study, but a PDF of this study will be made available to you on our Symposium website. If you'd like to take a deeper dive and read this article, the findings are very interesting. And Ben Dock in particular has been working very diligently over the years to expand the range of that. So we actually have data from 2011 to 2021 now. So we will be updating this research as well to provide a broader scope. But here are some of the findings from our initial study. So as you can see, because it's a 4-year window, there's a lot of states that are kind of missing. So for us in Arizona, everybody's like, what? There's been no arrests. But again, we were looking for very specific criteria, and it was in a very specific year range. So this information, as we are reporting, will grow. But during that 4-year range, we were able to identify 125 individuals who were arrested for labor trafficking in 20 different states in the United States. Some of the recruitment tactics that we were able to identify is that labor traffickers largely relied on staffing agencies, or creating this sense of professionality around recruitment through kind of a system of individuals who were recruiting and then transferring through staffing agencies, and also creating that third party piece that insulates them and protects them. So staffing agencies were used a lot. Other tactics included word of mouth, and of course, as none of us are surprised, online means of recruitment and technology. So that might have been through email or online ads. And we also saw some recruitment through Backpage, when Backpage was a thing. About 1 in 3 traffickers recruited victims through a staffing agency. Over 1 in 3 used debt bondage to force victims into labor trafficking. So that was kind of creating this false sense of debt and then using that as a term of employment to force that victim to work for them. Almost half of traffickers used promises of money and wealth. So saying, we're gonna make provide for a better life for you. We're gonna kind of create that better future for you. 37.6% used promises of goods and rewards at the time of recruitment. So promising incentives, maybe even providing incentives up front in order to get that individual to take part. And oftentimes those include incentives for the family as well. Over half of the traffickers used their job position or their position of authority as a means to impress or intimidate and recruit those victims. Over 1 in 4 used bait and switch tactics. So there's that level of trickery that we were talking about before, of saying you're going to come to do this, and then when they get there, they found out that they were going to be doing something much different. How were traffickers controlling? So almost in every single case, psychological violence was present, and that was through means of threats of violence, threats to harm the victim or the victim's family, threats with a firearm, threats to report to immigration or to deport. And then in over 1 in 4 cases, physical violence was used against the victim. Sexual violence was present in almost 1 in 5 cases. And then we also saw in over 1 in 4 cases, 26.4%, we saw the withholding of a victim's passport or visa. So there's that coercion element of withholding documents that are needed. We also saw some trends over that 4-year period, one of which was an increase in foreign national trafficker involvement. So over time, we started to see a growing involvement of foreign national traffickers as opposed to domestic. We also started to see an increase in the use of visa fraud. So utilizing legal means to exploit individuals and utilize those loopholes like we talked about. An increase in withholding of documents as a means to control and to keep that person in a trafficking situation. Labor traffickers providing victims with shelter as a recruitment tool. So that indicates an increase in victimizing people who have basic needs that need to be met. And then also we started to see a growing trend in exclusively victimizing migrant workers as opposed to domestic victims of trafficking. Transportation, even though doesn't have to be an element, it oftentimes is an element. And in these cases, we saw that in about half of the cases, labor traffickers crossed state lines with their victims, and some moved victims to, up to 8 different states throughout the United States. So this is one of the case studies, the different states that a trafficker kind of began, starting here and eventually ending in Texas. Very important for us as providers and as a point of intervention. In almost 3 out of every 4 cases, labor traffickers used public transportation to transport their victims. So they might have used rental cars, but they were also using buses and trucks and airplanes and trains, public transportation to transport victims, which is important for us to know because that is a critical point of intervention for service providers, especially for a crime that is so well hidden. This is the Youth Experiences Survey. This is the study that I was telling you about in which ASU surveys homeless young adults. We've been doing this survey for about 8 years. And in 2017, we added questions about labor exploitation. So the purpose of the Youth Experiences Survey is to gain an understanding of the unique vulnerabilities for this very vulnerable age range, age 18 to 25, and homeless individuals in the state of Arizona, to understand their life experiences, but also to understand the relationship. The survey doesn't demonstrate causality, one caused the other, but it does show us the relationship between trauma and life experiences and their experiences of homelessness. And we ask questions about sex trafficking. We also ask questions about labor exploitation. And again, we keep it at labor exploitation because the questions can't necessarily indicate a trafficking situation. As you know, it's difficult to do that. But we started asking questions about labor exploitation in the year 2017. And as you can see, this is the total sample number over here with the year. So in 2017, the total sample was 187 participants. And almost 1 in every 3 participants reported that they had experienced a labor trafficking situation. So they reported an experience that met the criteria for labor trafficking. And that has been consistent since we started. We have had individuals who are reporting experiences that are consistent with labor exploitation that range from 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 participants. That's an astounding number who have experienced labor exploitation. And again, it's due to those unique vulnerabilities. In those studies over the years, we also found that homeless young adults who reported experiencing labor exploitation were significantly more likely to also report extensive trauma histories, extensive experiences of physical abuse or neglect, emotional abuse and neglect, sexual abuse, mental health challenges that are pretty significant, such as PTSD, depression, schizophrenia, suicide attempts, long-term physical health ramifications, adverse childhood experiences. They're significantly more likely to have experienced 4 or more ACEs, which, as we know, research demonstrates has long-term negative health consequences. And so individuals who are homeless young adults who have experienced labor exploitation have a multitude of needs, not just vulnerabilities that create the environment for them to be exploited, but also incredible needs for recovery as well. I'm nearing the end of my time here, but I did want to show you this graphic, which is also going to be available in a brochure that I'm going to be talking to you about in just a second. But this was developed by an individual named Gonzalo Martinez de Vidia, who was previously from the McCain Institute of International Leadership and is now doing this work in Brazil. And he created this graphic that I think is just so powerful because it represents the barriers to identifying and helping individuals exit a labor trafficking situation. So as you can see, the labor trafficking victim is down here on the bottom, and there's all of these systems and pieces that are compounded on top that create the difficulty for us to identify, but also for the labor trafficking victim to seek help. So you have those system savvy traffickers that we've talked a lot about today who know how to navigate legal channels and who know how to prey on vulnerabilities. You have risk aversive employers who want that third party who are kind of insulated from responsibility for and accountability for what happens to their workers. You have industry funded aid groups who are impacted by the agenda of the industries that work for them, as well as government agencies who are also mindful of industries that are lobbying, that are providing funding. There's also immigration-focused law enforcement or law enforcement who are simply overwhelmed or this focus, labor trafficking is not a focus. There's oftentimes a lack of understanding that labor trafficking is existing in the community, and because we can't see it, it's not a focus of law enforcement. So oftentimes when when law enforcement comes across labor trafficking, it tends to be by accident because they were investigating something else. Or it tends to be in states where that have proximity to a border, where they're looking for immigration, and in immigration violations, they're starting to find some trafficking situations that are taking place. So there isn't a lot of proactive policing that's going on towards this issue for a variety of reasons: lack of funding, lack of understanding about it as an issue, cultural norms around immigration. High standard prosecutors who may not be willing to take cases if they don't feel like that case will be successful, or if there's not enough to demonstrate. Sex trafficking focused law and policy. So we talked about this earlier today, that sex trafficking is really the focus of our work in this nation, and actually in the anti-trafficking field at large. And because of that, all of the innovations in law and policy tend to provide a lot of protections for sex trafficking, but not the same for labor trafficking. And also because sex trafficking is easily more identifiable, our laws make it much more concrete and have more teeth to be able to prosecute and to build cases. And so a lot of our law and policy is very sex trafficking heavy, and we're really lacking in labor trafficking protections. And lastly, slow arriving relief from service providers, because we have trouble, and law enforcement, because we have trouble identifying where it's happening, who it's happening to, and there are many barriers that prevent us from being able to reach and also serve that population. So as you can see, there are many reasons why a person struggles to escape a labor trafficking situation or has trouble trusting and reaching out to individuals who might be able to help. Other barriers to leaving a trafficking situation include simple structural barriers, like I'm either isolated and I don't have that freedom of movement, which is very typical in a labor trafficking situation, but also being unfamiliar of your surroundings, being unable to, not knowing the labor rights or feeling like they don't have any rights, maybe not being able to speak the same language, moving around a lot. So not having the ability or the time or the freedom to reach out for support, having lack of documents and having that being held over their head or having documents removed, basic needs that need to be met, or dependency created upon the trafficker for financial needs, threats and fear of retaliation or actual retaliation that they're experiencing. And then, of course, not knowing who to reach out to and not knowing who they can trust. There are many indicators of labor trafficking. Some of these, of course, require a person to come in contact with a person who's experiencing labor trafficking, which may be quite rare. But indicators of labor exploitation that could go further and should be investigated for trafficking include those wage and hour violations, right? So being paid very little or none at all, frequent movement, claiming they're just visiting, being unaware of their surroundings or being able to provide an address, a physical address for where they're staying, residing in hotels or motels, providing stories that seem very rehearsed or inconsistent, or not being able to speak for themselves, working long hours in substandard working conditions, exhibiting malnourishment, sleep deprivation, poor hygiene, and signs of abuse, old and new. And then also in conjunction with a lot of those elements, just presenting as extremely nervous or fearful or disoriented. This is that exciting and amazing labor trafficking brochure that I was telling you about that was developed by our office in partnership with a lot of national experts, including Gonzalez, Martinez, Davidia, and my partner, my colleague, Bandak. And our office developed this awesome training brochure that includes a lot of this introductory information that was presented here today. So it provides those definitions, it provides information about recruitment and control, information about how to reach out, what to do, numbers to call, It talks a little bit about child labor trafficking as well in there. And this is a great resource. It's an 8-page document that is a great resource for training if you're conducting trainings in your community. It's also a great tool to educate the community, but also to kind of provide education to someone who might be at risk or who might be vulnerable to labor trafficking situation. It's an approachable way to kind of start that conversation. And this brochure is provided in English, Spanish, and Arabic at the moment. And these brochures are free for you electronically and will be provided starting today. This is our first kind of launch of this resource on the Symposium website. So under my segment, you will be able to find this training tool in all 3 languages in a high resolution electronic copy for you to be able to save and utilize. And again, we're very excited about this, very proud of this document, and we hope that it will be a useful tool for training staff, training the community, and even starting to engage individuals or populations that are high risk or that you might suspect might be involved in a trafficking situation to begin this conversation around what it is and how do we help support. So again, that will be made available on our Symposium website, and we're very excited about it. My name is Kristen. I'm the Associate Director of the STIR office, and that's Dominique's contact. You met her earlier today. This is that Labor Trafficking Symposium website that currently has the agendas and all of the speaker bios, but after the symposium is over, it will also contain the videos and also any supplemental materials that the presenters provide, including that article that I told you about, the national study, and the training brochures. And if you'd like to learn more about the STIR office and what we do and more of our research, you can also visit our ASU website as well.